Ma'am, this cabin isn't for your kind. Maybe you got on the wrong plane. The words came sharp, cold, and without hesitation. Olivia Smith didn't whisper them. She didn't flinch. She stood tall in her uniform, a tray in one hand, and stared directly at the elegant black woman seated in 2A, as if she had just caught an intruder. The woman, Emily Johnson, lifted her eyes, calm and unwavering, and stared back. A second passed, then another, around them. The first-class cabin of Delta Flight 217 hushed, as if someone had flipped a switch. Conversations faded, phones were lowered, forks paused mid-air. It was the kind of silence that isn't just quiet. It's electric. And yet, Emily didn't raise her voice. She didn't flinch. She just said, evenly, "Excuse me?" Olivia, perhaps realizing she'd gone too far, forced a tight-lipped smile and added, "We'll be starting service shortly," then turned to serve the white gentleman across the aisle with a gleaming smile and a flourish that bordered on performance. "Before we go any further, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. And while you're here, don't forget to subscribe for more real, powerful stories like this one. Give us a like if you believe everyone deserves respect, no matter what seat they're in. Now, let's go back to what really happened that morning. It was a crisp autumn day in Atlanta. Hartsfield-Jackson International buzzed with the usual chaos of early morning departures, but up in first class, on Delta Flight 217 bound for Chicago. The atmosphere was calm, luxurious even. Polished leather seats, polite greetings, fresh coffee. Emily Johnson, a composed woman in her late 50s, sat alone with her handbag tucked neatly under the seat in front of her. She wore a tailored cream suit and low black heels. Her hair was pulled back in a neat chignon. She looked like someone who belonged, because she did. But what no one else in that cabin knew, not even the crew, was that Emily wasn't just any passenger. She was the CEO of Delta Airlines. She'd boarded this flight without fanfare, without an assistant, and without alerting the staff to her title. She did it on purpose. Over the past few months, complaints had come across her desk, letters and emails from customers of color, quietly describing subtle slights, cold service, and being treated differently. Nothing overt, nothing that screamed racism, but patterns. And Emily believed in facing problems from the inside. So here she was, incognito, with a notebook tucked in her purse, prepared to see the truth with her own eyes. But she hadn't expected it to come this quickly, or this blatantly. Olivia Smith, the flight attendant in question, had begun her beverage service. She moved down the aisle with grace and charm, offering juice and champagne with a wide smile. She knelt beside a white man in 2B, Brian Riley, a retired lawyer with silver hair and a navy blazer. "Mr. Riley, would you like sparkling or still?" she asked sweetly. Brian accepted a mimosa, complimenting her professionalism. Then Olivia stood up, looked at Emily, and walked right past. No offer, no eye contact, not even a nod. Emily let it go, for the moment. She waited as Olivia continued to serve the other passengers, weaving between the seats with practiced ease. Then, as Olivia passed by her row again, Emily raised a hand and gently asked, "May I please have some water?" Olivia paused. Her eyes flickered, her lips pressed together, just for a second. Then came that now infamous sentence, "Ma'am, this cabin isn't for your kind." And then, the weak cover-up, the forced smile, and the turn away. Emily sat quietly, hands folded in her lap, heart steady. She had heard worse. She had lived through worse. From growing up in a working-class Detroit neighborhood, to becoming one of the few black women to rise through the male-dominated world of aviation. She had endured countless obstacles, but today wasn't about enduring. It was about exposing, documenting, changing Brian Riley, across the aisle, shifted in his seat. He had heard it too. His brow furrowed, and he glanced at Emily, then at Olivia, then back again. But he said nothing. Not yet. Emily could feel the weight of the room settling on her shoulders. Not just the eyes watching, but the familiar sense of being tested, measured, judged. Still, she didn't respond with anger. Instead, she reached into her bag and quietly opened her phone, tapping a few notes into a private document. Time, flight number, name badge, Olivia Smith. Interaction, denied service, inappropriate comment, no response to request. She slipped the phone back into her bag and looked straight ahead. The plane hadn't even left the gate, and already, a line had been drawn. Olivia returned a few minutes later to offer Brian a snack, warm nuts in a porcelain dish, followed by a napkin and a second mimosa. She didn't even glance at Emily. Brian looked uncomfortable, very uncomfortable. He cleared his throat. "Excuse me, miss," he said. "I don't think you served the lady in 2A. Olivia didn't even blink. "We're following protocol," she said curtly, and moved on. Brian leaned slightly toward Emily and said quietly, "I saw everything. I wasn't sure what to say." Emily gave a polite smile. "Sometimes saying nothing speaks volumes," she replied, but her voice held no bitterness, only purpose. As the last of the passengers boarded and the cabin door was secured, Emily glanced out the window. The tarmac buzzed with motion, but inside that cabin, a storm had already begun. She wasn't here to cause a scene. She was here to hold up a mirror, and Olivia Smith had just given her the perfect reflection. The question now wasn't whether Emily would act. It was how and when. Because this wasn't just a slight. It was a spotlight, and she was going to make sure it illuminated everything. The tension didn't fade as the plane taxied toward the runway. It thickened. Olivia Smith's bias, once subtle, now grew bolder with each passing minute. As beverage service resumed, her actions became a study in contrast. She floated between rows with grace for some and indifference for others. Brian Riley, the white passenger across from Emily, received a second napkin, a fresh drink, and a warm smile. "You're such a gentleman," Olivia cooed as she gently handed him a tiny salted chocolate bar, the kind reserved for Delta's premium clients. But when she passed Emily again, who was still without so much as a glass of water, Olivia barely slowed her stride. Emily, maintaining her composure, raised a hand politely. "Excuse me," she said again, her voice calm but clear. Olivia stopped, turned slightly, and with a sigh heavy with attitude, muttered, "You'll need to wait your turn, ma'am. We're very busy." Then she walked away. The woman in the seat behind Emily glanced up from her tablet. A man 2 rows ahead raised his eyebrows, then quickly looked away. No one spoke, but the unfairness was no longer just felt. It was seen. Brian leaned over again, his voice a quiet murmur. "This isn't right. She's going out of her way to ignore you." Emily gave a small nod. "She's not ignoring me. She's making a point." Brian's eyes narrowed. He was beginning to understand. Emily sat back in her seat, her mind alert. She had lived too many years in boardrooms and back rooms to miss what was happening. This wasn't a mistake. It was a pattern, a deliberate choice. And if Olivia believed her quietness was weakness, she was gravely mistaken. At the back of the cabin, a young flight attendant named Roman Hughes watched from the galley. Only a few months into his role with Delta, Roman had trained hard for this job. He believed in the airline. He believed in what it stood for. But today, something felt off. He'd noticed Olivia's behavior from the start, how she avoided the black woman in 2A, how her tone changed when addressing her, how the warmth in her voice evaporated every time she looked that way. Roman wasn't sure what he was allowed to do. He'd only been on the job for 90 days, still on probation. But his gut told him this wasn't just a customer service oversight. It was something deeper. In the cockpit. Captain Marcus Burns gave his final pre-flight announcement. His voice came steady over the intercom, calm and familiar to many passengers who'd flown with him before. "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is your captain speaking. We're currently delayed for a brief mechanical inspection, which should be resolved shortly. Thank you for your patience." Then the line clicked off, up front. Olivia seemed unbothered by the delay. She made her way down the aisle again, chatting with a woman in 1C, laughing lightly. But when she reached Emily's row, she didn't even glance her way. Emily decided to test her professionalism. "Excuse me," she said once more. "I have a dietary restriction. Is it possible to request the vegetarian option for lunch?" Olivia's response was immediate and without empathy. "We ran out of that one. You'll have to take what's left." Then she turned to Brian and offered him the same meal with a sweet, practiced smile. "Would you prefer the salmon or the pasta, Mr. Riley? Both are excellent." Brian glanced from Olivia to Emily, then back again. "Are you telling me she doesn't get a choice?" Olivia's smile faltered just for a second, then snapped back. "We have limited inventory today, standard procedure." Brian shook his head slightly. "It doesn't feel very standard." Emily declined Brian's offer to share part of his meal with a polite wave of her hand. "Thank you," she said softly, "but I'm okay." Olivia disappeared into the galley again. Emily sat still, her heart steady, her mind sharper than ever. This wasn't her first flight, and it certainly wasn't her first encounter with bias masked as policy. But now, she had evidence. Passengers were noticing. And Roman. She could feel his eyes occasionally glance her way, conflicted, uncomfortable, but not cruel. There was still integrity somewhere on this flight. She just had to find the right moment to bring it forward. Behind her. Whispers began to ripple across the cabin. A young couple whispered in Spanish about what they had seen. An older woman clutched her pearls and muttered, "Well, I never—" Brian pulled out his phone, stared at it for a moment, then put it down. Emily didn't need video. She needed truth. She was here not to shame, but to reveal. From the corner of her eye, she saw Roman emerge slowly from the galley. He walked toward her row, paused, and leaned over. "Ma'am, can I get you anything at all? Water? Tea?" His voice was soft, respectful. His hands slightly trembled. Emily looked up at him, surprised, then smiled warmly. "Water would be lovely. Thank you." Roman nodded, then quickly walked back. Olivia, standing in the galley, shot him a glare. Roman avoided her eyes when he returned with the water. He placed it gently on Emily's tray and gave her a subtle nod. Olivia watched it all from a distance, her jaw clenched. Her authority was being questioned, and she didn't like it. Brian noticed, too. "Looks like someone else knows what respect looks like," he said, nodding toward Roman. Emily nodded in return. "He does, and he'll need it in this world." The plane remained grounded for another few minutes, but the emotional turbulence had already reached altitude. As the engines idled outside, a quiet fire burned within Emily. She didn't want revenge. She didn't need to embarrass anyone, but she would not let this slide. She would not let Olivia's behavior become another forgotten moment. Her silence wasn't submission. It was strategy. Every second was being observed. Every injustice was being logged, not just by her, but now by others. This was no longer just her flight. It was about every passenger who had ever been made to feel invisible. And if Olivia thought she was just a silent black woman in a suit, She was about to learn exactly who she was dealing with. The plane still hadn't taken off, but inside the cabin, a different kind of turbulence had begun to shake the air. Emily sat calmly, her hands resting on the armrest, her expression composed but unreadable. She had waited long enough. The dismissiveness, the unequal treatment, the veiled contempt. It had all added up to something far heavier than an ignored drink order. It had become a matter of dignity, without a word. She leaned slightly forward and pressed the silver call button above her seat. The soft chime sounded overhead. Olivia, standing near the galley, turned her head sharply, saw who it was, and rolled her eyes. She made no move. She stood still, arms crossed, as if daring Emily to press it again. When Emily did, this time twice, Olivia snapped into motion, walking briskly down the aisle with an expression that barely concealed her annoyance. "Yes?" she asked curtly. Her tone clipped. "I'd like to speak to the captain," Emily said evenly. Her voice was calm, controlled, but carried weight. Olivia blinked. For a moment, she looked confused, maybe even a little afraid. "He's busy," she said quickly, her voice tight. "Final checks. He can't come out right now." "That's fine," Emily replied, still calm. "Please let him know I'm requesting to speak with him. Immediately." Olivia stood frozen. Then, suddenly, a voice rang out from across the aisle, stronger, louder. "She has every right to speak to the captain," Brian said, his voice firm. "We all saw what happened, and frankly, I think it's time someone did something about it." A ripple went through the cabin. Olivia's face flushed. She opened her mouth to respond, but found no words. Passengers began turning in their seats. Some nodded, some looked away, ashamed, and some simply stared, waiting to see what would happen next. Olivia hesitated, then turned stiffly and walked toward the cockpit. Moments later, the cabin door opened, and out stepped Captain Marcus Burns, tall, distinguished, silver gray at the temples, calm authority in every step, his uniform crisp, his eyes sharp. He looked over the cabin quickly, taking in the tension that hung in the air like static, and then his eyes met Emily's. A flicker of recognition flashed across his face. He didn't hesitate. "Ms. Johnson," he said, his voice steady, respectful. "It's been a long time. What seems to be the issue here?" Olivia's head snapped around. Confusion painted across her face. "Wait, you know her?" Marcus turned to Olivia. "Yes, I do. She's the reason I'm still flying, and she's the reason you have a job." Emily stood slowly. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't wave her arms. But the moment she rose, the room shifted again. "Captain Burns," she said, "I've been on this flight for over 20 minutes. I've made 3 polite requests, for water, for a meal option, for basic service, and each time, I was ignored, dismissed, denied." Her tone never wavered. Meanwhile, passengers around me were served with smiles, offered extras, and treated with courtesy. The difference in treatment was not accidental. It was intentional. Olivia began to sputter. "That's not true. She's exaggerating. I didn't mean." Marcus raised a hand. "I'll ask you to let her finish." Brian stood. "Captain, I saw it too. She's not exaggerating. I tried to speak up earlier, but it kept getting worse. The rest of us were treated like VIPs. She was treated like baggage." A few passengers nodded in agreement. Roman, still standing near the galley, stepped forward quietly. "Sir," he said, his voice nervous but clear, "I witnessed it too. I tried to help. I offered her water after it was denied. I heard what was said." Olivia spun to him, her voice full of disbelief. "Roman, what are you doing?" But Roman didn't flinch. He stood taller, straighter. "What's right?" Captain Burns turned back to Olivia, His voice was calm, but it carried the finality of a closed door. "Do you understand who Ms. Johnson is?" Olivia shook her head slowly, completely lost now. "She's a passenger. She's the CEO of Delta Airlines," Marcus said. The cabin gasped, audible, sharp, the kind of gasp that leaves a mark. Olivia took a step back, her mouth parting, her hands trembling. "What?" she whispered. I didn't know." "You didn't care," Emily said, not unkindly, but with clarity. "That's the problem." Olivia looked around as if searching for escape, but none came. Brian sat down slowly, still watching. Roman remained near the galley, his jaw tight. Passengers all around leaned in, caught in the moment. "This isn't about me," Emily continued. "It's about how easily a woman like me can be overlooked, dismissed, even insulted, because of the assumptions you carry, because of the way I look. The seat I paid for didn't change that. The smile I offered didn't matter. But what does matter is what happens next." Marcus nodded solemnly. "Ms. Johnson, with your permission, I'd like to remove Ms. Smith from first-class service immediately. I'll assign Roman to this cabin for the remainder of the flight." Emily nodded once. "Thank you, Captain. That's appropriate." Marcus turned to Olivia. "You'll report to the rear galley for the remainder of the flight. We'll be reviewing this incident upon landing." Olivia opened her mouth, but the words never came. She turned and walked down the aisle, every step heavier than the last. The silence was louder than any shouting could have been. When the curtain closed behind her, Emily slowly returned to her seat. Roman stepped forward with a water bottle and placed it gently on her tray table. "Is there anything else I can do for you, ma'am?" he asked quietly. Emily looked up at him, saw the honesty in his eyes, and smiled. "Just keep being who you are," she said. "That's more than enough." The cabin remained hushed, not because people were afraid, but because something powerful had just unfolded. A shift, a reckoning, a reminder. Emily didn't need applause. She didn't need attention. She had something far more lasting. Respect, earned not just through title, but through truth. And Flight 217 would never forget it. The moment Olivia disappeared behind the thick navy curtain, the air in the cabin changed. It was as if something toxic had been expelled, like a window had been opened after a long time. The passengers weren't just silent now, they were watchful, alert, awakened. Emily remained seated, her expression composed, her posture relaxed, but there was a quiet fire behind her eyes. Captain Marcus Burns turned back toward the front of the cabin and made his way slowly down the aisle, stopping just beside her seat. "Ms. Johnson," he said, voice low but firm, "I want to personally apologize for what you've endured today. This behavior does not reflect the values of this airline, or of my crew." Emily looked up at him, meeting his gaze with calm strength. "Thank you, Captain. But I'm not here for an apology. I'm here because I've received too many reports that today's treatment wasn't an isolated incident. It's part of something deeper, something systemic. I needed to see it for myself." There was a murmur behind them. Some passengers shifted in their seats, clearly uncomfortable now, not with her words, but with the realization that they'd witnessed what too many people experience every day and said nothing until it was convenient. Brian Riley, sitting quietly across the aisle, spoke up with a weight in his voice. "She's right. We've all been too quiet for too long. I should have said something sooner. I saw it happening from the beginning, and I didn't act." Emily turned to him and gave a nod, not in judgment, but in acknowledgement. "It takes courage to admit that. More than you know." Just then, Roman stepped forward, now assigned to first-class service. He stood tall, but there was nervousness in his eyes. "Ma'am," he said gently, "I've restocked the galley. Would you like to begin meal service now?" Emily offered a smile. "Yes, thank you. Roman, and I'd like the vegetarian option, if that's available." Roman smiled back. "Absolutely, ma'am. We've got plenty," as he turned to begin. Marcus remained for a beat longer, then addressed the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to formally introduce the woman seated in 2A. This is Ms. Emily Johnson, CEO of Delta Airlines. I can say from personal experience that her leadership has transformed this company, and it is a privilege to have her aboard." A wave of gasps swept through the cabin. A few passengers straightened in their seats. Others looked down, embarrassed. Someone in row 3 whispered, "That explains everything." A woman 2 rows behind leaned forward and said, "She didn't carry herself like she needed to prove anything. That's real power." Emily stood now, not to grandstand, not to gloat, but to speak. Her voice was clear, strong, and full of conviction. "I'm not here as your CEO today. I'm here as your fellow passenger. What happened today wasn't about rank or title. It was about humanity. Everyone deserves to be treated with dignity, regardless of race, gender, appearance, or seat number. And when that doesn't happen, we must be willing to face it head on." She turned to Roman, who had just returned with her meal. "And when we see someone doing the right thing, we need to uplift them too. Thank you, Roman, for your professionalism, your courage, and your respect." Roman flushed slightly but stood a little taller. The applause started quietly, from the back, then slowly spread forward. Not thunderous, but steady, sincere, the kind that means more than volume ever could. Olivia, still in the rear galley, heard it. She stood with her back to the door, arms folded, face blank. But her pride had been wounded in a way she hadn't expected, not just by being caught, but by being shown up, quietly, completely, by a woman she had dismissed without even knowing her name. Meanwhile, Captain Burns returned to the cockpit, and the flight finally received clearance to take off. As the aircraft lifted off the Atlanta runway and climbed into the autumn sky, the passengers in first class were no longer thinking about the delay. They were thinking about what they had seen, what they had failed to do, and what it meant going forward. Emily took a sip of her water, her eyes gazing out at the clouds, her mind not on vengeance, but on the future. This flight was no longer just about reaching Chicago. It had become something more, a moment of reckoning, of revelation, of quiet transformation. Brian leaned over once again. "If you ever need someone to write about this, I've still got a few good legal words left in me." Emily smiled. "We may just need them." Roman continued to serve passengers with care and poise, his hands steadier now, his voice more confident. Each interaction was a reminder that leadership wasn't just about title, it was about example. Olivia's absence was noticeable, but her silence was louder than her protests could have been. And as the plane leveled at cruising altitude, the passengers in first class were left with more than warm towels and folded linens. They were left with a story they would tell again and again, about a woman who sat quietly in a seat they thought they understood, and reminded them all that respect is not optional, and justice doesn't wear a name tag. The plane had finally reached cruising altitude, but the emotional altitude inside the first-class cabin remained high, though the curtain had closed behind Olivia Smith. Her presence still lingered, like smoke in the air, acrid and unforgettable. Roman Hughes moved with care now, balancing confidence with duty as he served drinks and meals to the passengers who, just minutes earlier, had witnessed the unraveling of a prejudice they could no longer pretend wasn't there. He glanced toward seat 2A every so often, where Emily Johnson now sat calmly, eating her vegetarian meal with quiet grace, her presence still commanding without a word. In the rear galley, Olivia stood stiffly against the counter, arms crossed, her thoughts racing, humiliated. Yes, but more than that, indignant. She couldn't believe what had just happened. How was she supposed to know who that woman was? She hadn't worn a badge, she hadn't announced herself. In Olivia's mind, this wasn't justice, it was entrapment. Favoritism, she muttered under her breath. That's all it was. Everyone's just afraid to say it. She kicked at the bottom of the galley cart and let out a quiet huff of frustration. That woman had turned the entire flight against her. And Roman? He had betrayed her. He was supposed to be new, to follow her lead. But instead, he'd thrown her under the bus just to impress the big boss. Unbelievable, she whispered. She played the race card. That's all this is. What Olivia couldn't admit, what she wouldn't even let herself think, was that maybe this had been building for a long time, maybe that bitterness, the kind that had taken root years ago when her brother was killed in a robbery, had quietly poisoned her. She had told herself over and over again that she didn't judge people, that she treated everyone the same. But the truth was, she didn't. And now, for the first time, she couldn't hide it. In the forward cabin, Captain Marcus Burns sat quietly in the cockpit, his co-pilot adjusting instruments while the autopilot held steady. But his thoughts remained with the cabin behind him. He had flown thousands of flights in his career, seen passengers cry, celebrate, and fall in love at 3,000 feet. But today had been something else. Today, he had witnessed a moment of reckoning that had nothing to do with turbulence or schedules. It had to do with character. And Marcus knew something else, too. This flight would be remembered long after landing. Meanwhile, Roman returned to Emily's row, offering a warm towel and asking softly if she needed anything else. She looked at him, studying his face. The nerves were still there, but beneath them, something had changed. His voice had weight now. His steps carried purpose. "You did well," she said gently. "It's not easy. Speaking up when you're new. Most people stay silent for years." Roman exhaled a breath he didn't know he was holding. "Honestly," he admitted, "I wasn't sure if I'd have a job after this flight." Emily smiled. Just a little. "That fear is real. I know it too well. But silence never made anything better. You did the right thing. And Delta needs more people like you." Her words landed heavier than she knew. Roman's father had worked baggage handling for 25 years. His uncle had driven shuttle buses at the airport. And now here he was, one of the first in his family to wear the wings. He had always wanted to be part of something bigger. But until this flight, he hadn't known how. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Truly." Emily nodded once and returned to her seat. Brian Riley leaned over again, his voice softer now, reflective. "I don't think I've ever seen anything like that before," he said. "I've heard stories, sure, but seeing it happen, seeing you handle it the way you did, it shook something loose in me." Emily looked at him and offered a knowing smile. "That's how change begins. Not in big speeches, but in quiet shifts." Brian sat back, his expression thoughtful. In the galley, Olivia finally worked up the courage to confront Captain Burns. She pressed the intercom and requested a word. Moments later, Marcus met her at the rear of the plane. "Captain," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "I think this whole situation was blown out of proportion. I was just doing my job. That woman blindsided me." Marcus stared at her, unreadable. "That woman," he repeated, slowly, "is the CEO of this airline. And more importantly, she's a human being who was treated with less respect than every other passenger in first class." You weren't just doing your job. You ignored her. You belittled her. And now you're trying to make excuses. Olivia's mouth opened, then closed. You don't know what I've been through, she said. You don't know what it's like. Marcus's eyes narrowed. You're right. I don't know your story, but I do know this. Pain doesn't give you permission to cause more of it. You don't get to use your history to justify your prejudice. He paused, then added, You're suspended pending review. We'll speak again when we land. Olivia's face hardened. So that's it? You're choosing her over me? I'm choosing integrity, he replied, and accountability. She didn't respond, just turned and walked back to the galley, jaw clenched, shoulders stiff. Her world hadn't just shifted, it had cracked, and she wasn't ready to face what might come through the cracks. In the cabin, the mood had changed, not festive, but clear. There was a shared understanding now, among passengers, among crew, that something meaningful had happened, that the sky they were flying through wasn't just filled with clouds, but with the weight of something unspoken finally being said. Emily sat back in her seat, closed her eyes for a moment, and breathed deeply. She wasn't angry. She wasn't triumphant. She was focused. This was only the beginning, and when the wheels touched down in Chicago, she already knew what would happen next. She wouldn't just file a report, she would rewrite policy. She would call in her team. She would start something that lived beyond this flight, and it would start with truth. As the plane leveled into its cruising altitude and the seatbelt signs blinked off with a quiet chime, the cabin of Flight 217 settled into a soft hum, but the stillness felt different now. It wasn't just the ordinary quiet that comes after meal service. It was the kind that follows a revelation, the kind that comes when people have seen something uncomfortable and real and can no longer unsee it. Emily Johnson sat by the window in 2A, her tray cleared, her water glass half full, but her mind still turning over the weight of everything that had happened since boarding. She stared out at the clouds, so peaceful, so distant, while inside, something much closer was taking shape. She wasn't thinking about press releases or damage control or optics. She was thinking about culture, about legacy, about how the smallest interaction at 3,000 feet could reflect something far larger than a single flight, across the aisle. Brian Riley remained unusually quiet. His fingers tapped absent-mindedly on his armrest. He'd practiced law for most of his adult life, argued in courtrooms, negotiated billion-dollar contracts. But today, something in him had shifted. He leaned over again, not to offer comfort, but to confess. I think I've spent most of my life thinking I wasn't part of the problem, he said, his voice low, because I wasn't the one saying the wrong thing. But today made me realize, staying silent, that's part of it too. Emily turned to him, her expression softening. You're not alone in that realization, she said. Most people never intend to do harm, but when we don't speak up, we allow it to grow. Change doesn't start with the loudest person. It starts with the one who finally says, "This isn't okay." Brian nodded slowly, his eyes distant now, as if reviewing every time he'd stayed quiet in a meeting, at a dinner party, in a hallway conversation. I won't be quiet again, he said. That much I know. Farther down the aisle, Roman moved with new confidence. The weight in his shoulders had shifted, not from fear of losing his job, but from the realization that he had something to contribute beyond service trays and drink orders. What Emily had said to him lingered. Delta needs more people like you. No one had ever said anything like that to him before. He had always followed the rules, kept his head down, learned the scripts, but now he understood something deeper. His presence mattered, his voice mattered, and silence, even when polite, could be complicit. As he passed row 3, an older black woman stopped him gently with a hand on his arm. "You stood up," she said softly, "even when it was hard. Thank you." Roman smiled, his throat tight. "Thank you, ma'am," he replied. "I was raised to believe doing the right thing wasn't optional." Back in her seat, Emily pulled a small leather-bound notebook from her handbag and opened it to a blank page. With a smooth pen, she began to write, not notes for HR, not legal memos, but something more personal. Change starts with one voice, one action, one moment of truth. She paused, then wrote another line. "The sky is the same for all of us. The way we treat each other in it shouldn't change based on who's sitting in which seat." She closed the notebook and tucked it away. She wasn't angry. Not anymore. She was energized. Because now, she had not only witnessed what had been quietly damaging her company's spirit, but she had felt it, lived it. And no boardroom report could replace that kind of clarity. She would act, not with fury, but with direction. Olivia, meanwhile, remained in the rear galley, silent, arms folded tightly across her chest. The applause from earlier still echoed in her mind. Though it had long faded, she didn't understand how it had come to this. Or maybe she did, and just didn't want to admit it. She thought of the moment she told Emily, "This cabin isn't for your kind." The words had slipped out before she could catch them, like a reflex. And now, they sat in her chest like a stone. The shame hadn't sunk in yet, but the consequence had. She would be suspended, maybe even fired, and part of her still wanted to believe she was the victim. But deep down, another part, the part she rarely allowed to speak, knew the truth. She hadn't seen Emily as a person. She had seen her as a threat, a disruption to what she thought first class should look like. And now, her own future was disrupted. Back in the cabin, Marcus sat quietly in the cockpit, listening to the soft tones of the co-pilot's updates while glancing occasionally at the captain's logbook. But his thoughts weren't on fuel readings or arrival times. They were on legacy. He'd flown with this airline for over 3 decades. He had fought his way into the cockpit when few black pilots were allowed to. He had sat through slights, been overlooked for promotions, smiled through assumptions, and now, in the twilight of his career, he had seen something that reminded him why he had stayed. Because change wasn't always loud. Sometimes. It was one woman, sitting alone, treated as invisible, who stood up without raising her voice and showed everyone what leadership really looked like. As the flight coasted toward Chicago, the clouds below broke open into golden light, casting a soft glow through the cabin windows. Emily watched the sun spill across the sky, her reflection visible faintly in the glass. She thought of her mother, a schoolteacher who always told her, "You don't have to be loud to be powerful. Just be clear. Just be consistent." And today, she had done just that, across the aisle. Brian Riley pulled out a notepad of his own. He wasn't sure what he would do yet, but he knew he would write something about this. An op-ed. Maybe a speech. Something. Because this wasn't just a flight. It was a lesson. One he needed to pass on. Roman returned one final time with warm towels before descent and gave Emily a respectful nod. "Thank you again," he said. Not for her status, but for her example. "No," Emily said gently. "Thank you for reminding me that courage lives everywhere, even in quiet corners." As the captain's voice came over the intercom with landing instructions, passengers straightened their seats and buckled in, but many of them weren't thinking about the city lights below or their final destination. They were thinking about what had unfolded above the clouds, about a moment that started small and turned into something unforgettable, a story that would leave the cabin, follow them down the jet bridge, and stay with them long after they reached baggage claim, when Flight 217 touched down at Chicago O'Hare. The wheels met the runway with a gentle thud, but for many on board, it felt like arriving in a different world than the one they'd departed from. The applause that sometimes accompanied landings was absent, replaced instead by something far more meaningful: reflection. The passengers filed out of the first-class cabin in respectful silence, some pausing to nod at Emily Johnson, others quietly thanking Roman, whose quiet composure had become a new symbol of strength. Emily waited until most of the cabin had cleared before rising, her movements unhurried, her mind already thinking ahead. She was no longer just a CEO returning from a flight. She was a witness, a catalyst, and now, she had work to do. Over the next 48 hours, her team at Delta would receive her full report, not a corporate memo, a directive. Mandatory training would be overhauled. A comprehensive diversity and accountability program would be implemented across all flights, starting not with the lower ranks, but at the leadership level. There would be changes in crew assessments, bias recognition protocols, and a new emphasis on culture over compliance. Emily wasn't interested in hollow apologies or temporary policies. She wanted transformation, and it would begin immediately. Roman Hughes was offered a new role, this time, not just in service, but as a training liaison in Delta's Employee Development Division. He accepted, humbled and proud, understanding now that his job wasn't just to serve drinks, but to serve a vision of equity in the skies. Emily personally recommended him. She told the board he represented not only the company's future, but its conscience. Brian Riley kept his word. A week later, an op-ed appeared in a major national paper. "I was silent on Flight 217, never again." In it, he recounted what he had seen, how he had hesitated, and why silence is never neutral. The article went viral, not because it was sensational, but because it was honest. People recognized themselves in it. Thousands shared their own stories in the comments, and across airports, lounges, and newsrooms, conversations that had long been avoided finally began. But not all journeys were as immediate. Olivia Smith's was far more complicated. Following her suspension, she was called into an internal review. Emily did not attend. She had already made her decision. Olivia would not be returning to flight duty, but instead of terminating her contract outright, Delta offered something unexpected: a path to understanding. She was required to complete a comprehensive bias rehabilitation program, not a checkbox training, but a deep, months-long engagement with educators, psychologists, and community leaders. It would be rigorous, it would be personal, and it would be optional. Olivia hesitated at first, resistant, still clinging to the idea that she had been blindsided. But something about the silence on that flight, something about the way the cabin had turned against her, had unsettled her in a way she couldn't shake. One night, weeks later, she sat alone and rewatched security footage from that day. Her posture, her tone, the look on Emily's face. For the first time, she saw it clearly, and she cried. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cathartic. It was quiet. But it was real. She enrolled, and the journey to unlearn what she'd buried for so long finally began. Back at Delta headquarters, Emily declined interviews and turned down talk shows. This wasn't about press. It was about people. She stood before her leadership team, not behind a podium, but in a circle, eye to eye. She told them the story, not as a CEO, but as a black woman who had sat in seat 2A and been told she didn't belong. She reminded them that no level of luxury can excuse indignity, that service without respect is just performance, and that every crew member, every manager, every executive had a responsibility to not just serve, but to see. Her words rippled outward, internally. They called it the Flight 217 standard, externally. Passengers noticed, reviews improved, complaints dropped, Delta didn't just change procedures, it changed tone, voice, posture. The culture began to shift, slowly, steadily, and through it all, Emily remained steady, visible not in headlines, but in outcomes. Months later, she boarded another flight, this time a short hop from Chicago to Detroit. She wore the same cream suit, carried the same black handbag. But this time, as she walked down the aisle, a young black girl, maybe 8 or 9, looked up from seat 6C and stared. Emily smiled and paused. "Are you flying for the first time?" she asked. The girl nodded, eyes wide. "I want to be a pilot," she whispered. Emily reached into her bag, pulled out the small leather notebook she always carried, and tore out the page she had written back on Flight 217. She handed it to the girl with a soft smile. "This is for you," she said. The girl took it, reading aloud. "Change starts with one voice, one action, one moment of truth." Her mother looked on, eyes glistening. Emily continued down the aisle and took her seat, as the plane prepared for takeoff. She looked out the window once more, the clouds slowly rolling past. She thought of all the voices she'd heard since that day, the ones who had spoken up, the ones who had stayed silent, and the ones who were just starting to find their courage. Legacy, she realized, wasn't built in boardrooms. It was built in moments, in aisle seats and galley whispers, in handwritten notes and quiet decisions. And sometimes, it was built when no one was looking, except the people who needed to see it most. Flight 217 had become more than just a flight. It had become a story, a standard, a seed planted in the skies. And Emily Johnson, without ever raising her voice, had changed the course of it all, not through force, but through grace. And as the plane climbed once more into the open sky, she closed her eyes, smiled faintly, and thought, "This is only the beginning." Thank you for watching. If this story touched you, please like, comment, and subscribe. See you in the next one.